Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Obus Partners. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about how developers and homeowners have been absolutely blindsided by Auckland Council's Watercare, who have introduced some new restrictions that are going to make it harder to build houses in Auckland. And it's an absolute doozy. So stick around for the next 15 minutes because you're going to learn how the council has blindsided these developers, about how housing's supply could get choked. And on top of that, we're also going to talk about how this new policy is going to impact investors, property developers, and homeowners. Now, Andrew, what is that news?
So what's happened is that Watercare, who organise all the infrastructure for sewage and stuff like that, they've now come out and said, hey, if you're building a new development, you can't connect to our existing infrastructure because we can't cope with any more growth.
And the interesting thing, to build a house, you obviously need the land, but you need resource consent. You need the building consent, but you also need to be able to connect the toilets and all of the water to Watercare's infrastructure. And the fact that Watercare is saying, hey, you might have a resource consent already, but if you don't have your building consent, then we might not let you connect to our infrastructure in these certain areas. It effectively means that some developers will have paid money to buy land. They might already have a resource consent, but they're not going to be able to build houses on there. So that's going to be a real struggle for some developers who have purchased land. So let's talk about which areas have effectively been red zoned or orange zoned in the map that we're looking at, where it's going to be a bit more restricted. First of all, we've got a lot of West Auckland. So places like Glen Eden, parts of Henderson, and even the top of Te Atatu Peninsula. The interesting thing is there is a significant amount of development going on in this area at the moment.
Yeah, that's the really challenging part. A lot of developers have bought land in these areas because it's relatively affordable to buy land. They're highly sought after as far as being able to build affordable properties there. Now people have been literally blindsided, like you say, where there is not going to be the ability to connect to those pipes unless you come up with another strategy. What does that mean for those developers?
The other interesting thing, and I'll just pull this up, Andrew, I didn't think I was going to talk about this on the show, but do you remember in February, we did a really interesting developer event where we're talking about where are developers building? And the fascinating thing, Andrew, is that if we look at where are people building a lot of houses in Auckland, a lot of it is in that exact zone out in West Auckland. So there is a lot of development that has been planned, but now potentially won't go ahead, specifically because of Watercare. Also, parts of the North Shore, especially around Devonport, and even some places we've been recommending properties in, like Beach Haven, that's now effectively been red zoned. And almost all of East Auckland around Howick and Pakuranga, and also Otara and Flatbush, that just basically anywhere where there has been a lot of building already, Watercare is saying, well, there's been so much development, or this is my read on the situation, there's been so much development there, we can't accommodate more. We don't have the money to upgrade the pipes. And therefore, because of that, we're not going to let anybody build there. You're going to have to ask us for permission, and that'll slow it down.
Yeah, imagine if you're a developer that's gone and spent probably millions of dollars on chunks of land to be able to develop this year. You're kind of just waiting for the market to pick up a little bit. You've got the resource consent. You didn't apply for building consent because why would you at that stage? Now you're just stuck carrying the baby.
And you're talking to a lot of developers. What are they saying to you?
This has probably been one of the most significant announcements in the 11 years that we've run this business. The developers in Auckland are pretty rattled at the moment, would be fair to say. I know that there are some who basically these areas are their core focus. So unless something changes or they find another way of getting a result to be able to build here, they don't have a business.
I saw a really interesting quote in the Herald from a developer who said, everyone says build affordable housing, but the reality on the ground is, nah, mate, the pipe's not big enough. Sorry about the zoning, making you think that you could build there or think otherwise. We had some plans, but had to bin them. So see ya in 2040. Have a nice day, and here's our invoice. So Watercare could stop a lot of developers from building, where in the past we didn't have this additional hoop to jump through. And so I suppose the big question for investors out there is, okay, if developing and building new houses becomes more difficult, specifically in Auckland, how does that impact the housing market?
Well, I think the first thing that you're going to see is you're going to see development or new developments dry up in certain parts of the city because if I'm a developer now and I've been thinking about re-entering the market and buying some land in Beach Haven, for example, because that's an area that there has been some development, they're probably unlikely to now go out and buy some land over the next 6 months, at least until either another solution's come up with or maybe these rules get relaxed if that's a possibility. And the number two is you're probably going to see developments move to different parts of the city now. So rather than go Beach Haven, maybe I find another spot and I'd start to develop there.
Yeah, it's quite funny actually. One developer that we work quite a bit with has been developing a lot up in Beach Haven, which now you might not be able to. They're now starting to develop a little bit more in Mount Roskill and Mount Albert, so you will see some movement there. The other thing that I've been thinking about is, are you going to see some developers branch out of Auckland then and then say, oh, look, it's a bit difficult to deal or work with Auckland Council, so let's try my hand in Tauranga or Hamilton City.
Yeah. One of the interesting things is it's probably not a bad time for this to happen because I do think there might need to be a review of this whole thing. And the rule that they're proposing right now, or the current rules, might end up changing. But right now in Auckland, you do have more available stock than usual.
The other interesting thing is, funnily enough, this could actually be really good for certain property investors. So if I think about some of the investors that have worked with our team at Opus Partners who have invested somewhere like Beach Haven, they've purchased properties there. If now it becomes more difficult to add more supply to Beach Haven, then we've still got Auckland's population increasing, which increases demand for housing, but supply is then not able to catch up as that demand grows in those specific areas. And that could actually help to increase house prices in those specific areas. So if you're an investor who has purchased and settled a property in those areas, you might actually not be too upset about this because it's slowing down the supply in your specific area. Now, the other thing that's really interesting is that the Auckland Council has also come out proposing quite large increases in what's called a developer contribution. So when a new house is built, the developer has to pay effectively a charge, a levy, a tax to the council because the council's got to pay for some new infrastructure. Now, what's interesting is the council's increasing or proposing to increase that developer contribution if you're in the inner northwest of Auckland from $25,000 up to $98,000. So that's an extra, like 73 grand worth of charge that a developer would have to pay.
Basically 4 times the amount.
Yeah, and that would then be passed on in terms of a high purchase price. If we think about Mangere, they want to increase it by another about 11 grand, from 18 grand to 29 grand. Mount Roskill, they want to go from 20 grand to 52 grand, so about an extra $32,000 worth of charge or levy. And Tamaki, they want to increase it from 30 grand up to almost $120,000. So we're talking about almost, what is it, like $90,000 worth of charge
per unit.
Yeah, and so that's going to make it much more expensive for developers to then go and build. And what's really fascinating is I sometimes hear developers say, well, that will just push house prices up. And it doesn't directly, right? Because just because the council wants to charge more money to build a unit in Tamaki, that doesn't mean that the price of an existing house goes up by $90,000. But what it does mean is there will be less of a supply response. So what tends to happen is we get more people moving into Auckland or to the country in general. Because you've got more demand, that pushes house prices up. But when house prices go up, it is then more profitable to develop houses. And so as you see more demand come into the market, you also get a supply response because, there are so many people moving to Auckland, house prices are going up, very profitable to build new houses, and so we get a supply response. More demand comes in, but you also see more developers building. Now, if you make it more difficult to build houses, whether because of Watercare's restrictions or you're going to charge these developers more money from the council through these developer contributions, then that supply response becomes delayed. And so when you see more demand come onto the market, that will push up house prices faster than would otherwise be the case. But it's not as simple as some developers say, where they say, if you charge us an extra $90,000, it means that house prices will go up $90,000 this year. No, that's not going to be the case, but you probably will see that house prices will increase a little bit faster than would otherwise be the case because you're not having new supply coming on. Now let's say, though, Because what would happen if you see these developer contributions go up, the price of new build properties or the sticker price of new build properties would probably go up because you've got that extra charge.
Yeah.
So what does an investor do?
Yeah, so potentially there is the possibility that you might see the cost that a developer charges go up quite significantly. We were in Australia recently and we were talking to developers there and mortgage brokers there. And interestingly enough, in Australia, there is a big disconnect between existing property prices and new property prices to the tune of like about 40%. So significant difference. In New Zealand, we're nowhere near that. We're somewhere between 6 and 10% more expensive to get a new build compared to an existing property. What you might see is you might see a further disconnect. So maybe it goes between 10 and 15% more expensive to buy a new build than an existing property. But again, nowhere near the 40% that you see in Australia.
But the thing that you've got to be aware of here then is if this would only impact Auckland, right?
Yeah.
Because the development contributions are only significantly increasing to this extent that we're aware of, specifically in Auckland, and that's where you've got these Watercare restrictions. And so I think the impact would be, well, why would I buy a new build in Auckland, which has just become more expensive? Maybe I'll go down and buy in Christchurch, or maybe I'll look at Wellington, maybe I'll look at some other part of the country that doesn't have this change in the charge that developers are having to pay. And just before anybody freaks out too much, like if you're buying a property in Auckland that's already got building consent and you know can connect to those pipes, that actually, given this new information, that might be a better deal than it was a couple of weeks ago, because now there is this chance that you've got a limited supply response as property prices grow. So if I've got a new build under contract and I'm thinking about buying it, how do I know if that property might be impacted by these new rules?
So probably you're going to want to get that information from the developer. Now, if you're working with someone like Opus can do that for you. But if you're working with a developer directly, you're going to need to contact them and make sure that they have got sign off to do this and or building consent.
Yeah, because if they don't have building consent, then what could happen? Maybe the project gets cancelled if they can't connect.
It might get cancelled, or maybe the developer's going to have to find a workaround. So a developer that I caught up with just at the weekend talking extensively about this thinks that he's got a workaround. Now, they've still got to go through the motions. This is very, very new. What's that smile for?
I'm loving that a developer's got a workaround. I want to know what it is.
Every developer is going to be looking at ways to get around this if they're developing in Auckland. There probably are some strategies that might be used overseas. I don't know I don't know whether or not that's the case. So we're going to have to see how this plays out.
And it's interesting to ask ourselves, well, okay, this is happening in Auckland, but are there any other places that are following a similar trend? And the answer's kind of not yet, but we've got to have a look at it. So if we think about Hamilton City Council, they have recently proposed some changes towards their water services. We don't know what the extent of those changes will be yet. They might start charging people separately for different types of water. And then, of course, the government's got their new act about local water done well, that kind of framework around, do you remember 3 waters?
Yeah.
It's kind of their response to that. So we'll see what happens. And I think this is going to be the next big story. It's funny how in property investment, having recorded this podcast every day for 5 years, you kind of see the big news stories in property that come up. We've had interest deductibility. Nobody's talking about that anymore because that's kind of been sorted. The bright line test, that was a big one. Building depreciation back in 2010, that was a big story that nobody talks about anymore. Ring fencing in 2018. This is probably going to be one of those things that we talk about quite a lot over the next 6 months as we see how it plays out. But certainly this has been quite a large shock for a number of developers. I'm getting emails from listeners of the show. I'm getting emails from accountants who are saying this is absurd. So it'll be something we talk about a lot and kind of unpack over the next 6 to 12 months. But certainly it could have a lot of impacts in Auckland. Couple of opportunities there for property investors if you can get the right deal, and some risks to worry about if you are a property developer. Right, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you want to see some of the graphs and maps that we're showing, just Google Opus Partners YouTube. It'll be the first thing that comes up. If you are watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We are on our way to hitting our goal of 50,000 subscribers. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back here tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.